Christmas is a time for family, joy, and giving. It's the season where children hang their stockings and eagerly await presents, where the smell of fresh pine needles fills the house, and where the warmth of a roaring fire provides comfort in the chill of winter. At least, that's how it should be. But in the darkness of the winter night, far beyond the reach of the festive glow of Christmas lights, there exists a force that punishes those who dare to be naughty. A force whose name is whispered in hushed tones by the superstitious and the fearful. Krampus. It was Christmas Eve, and the Thompson family had gathered for the first time in years at their old cabin in the woods. Snowflakes danced in the frosty wind as the forest outside appeared untouched, shrouded in a heavy blanket of snow. Inside, the house was warm, filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine, the crackling of a fire in the hearth, and the muffled voices of distant relatives who hadn't seen each other in too long. The children were excited, perhaps too excited. This Christmas was special. There would be no gifts under the tree. Instead, they had decided to spend the holiday in the spirit of togetherness, enjoying the rustic beauty of the cabin and the company of their loved ones. But among the laughter and merriment, there was a palpable tension in the air. Some of the adults spoke in low voices, occasionally glancing toward the windows as if watching for something, though none of them ever said what they were waiting for. Their grandmother, a woman who had never fully embraced the holiday spirit, kept her distance from the festivities. She sat by the fire with a cup of tea, staring into the flames with a look of solemnity that none of the children dared question. It wasn't until after dinner, when the children had begun their games and the adults settled into their post-meal reverie, that the first sound came. A scratching, a scraping noise. At first, they thought it was the wind. After all, the storm had intensified, the howl of the gale outside almost deafening. But as the scratching grew louder and more distinct, it no longer seemed like the work of nature. Grandmother stood up slowly, her face drained of color. She didn't speak, but her eyes, wide and alert, fixed on the front door, where the sound had originated. "What is it, Grandma?" young Peter asked, his voice small and uncertain. Her eyes flicked to him, and for a moment there was a flicker of something in her gaze. Fear. "It's him," she whispered. The adults dismissed her words as the ramblings of an old woman, a relic of stories told to children before they went to bed. But Peter, still small enough to believe in every shadow and every nightmarish tale, wasn't so sure. As the night wore on, the scratching continued, a low, gnawing sound, like claws dragging along wood. Then came the thumping, heavy footsteps, but not quite human. And then, suddenly, the wind stopped. The house fell silent. That was when they heard it. A scream. That night, the storm raged harder than ever before. Snow piled high against the windows. The wind whipped around the cabin like an animal on the hunt. Yet despite the howling outside, inside the cabin, there was an eerie stillness, as if the world outside had gone still just for them. Peter awoke in the dead of night, shivering in his bed. His covers were tangled around him, his breath quick and shallow. There was something wrong. Something had changed. He couldn't say what, but his instincts screamed at him to wake up. He tried calling out to his parents, but his voice caught in his throat. There was a strange, unsettling sound outside his window. The scraping had started again, only this time it was louder, closer. The thudding of something massive moved outside, like a predator circling its prey. Peter crawled out of bed and crept toward the window. His small hands gripped the cold windowsill as he peeked through the frosty glass. His eyes went wide as he saw what was out there. It was a figure, tall and monstrous, covered in dark fur and shadow. It had horns that spiraled upward, sharp and twisted like the branches of a long-dead tree. Its eyes burned with a malevolent red glow, and it dragged something heavy behind it, a sack. The creature moved with terrifying grace, its massive hooves clattering against the frozen ground. It sniffed the air like a beast tracking its prey, then turned toward the cabin. Krampus had come. Krampus is not just a myth or a fairy tale. He is the embodiment of punishment, a dark figure that arises when the innocence of Christmas is tainted by greed, envy, and misdeeds. For centuries, he has stalked the streets of Europe, punishing the wicked and dragging them away into the depths of the underworld. He is ancient, he is relentless. And now, he has come to the Thompson cabin. Inside the house, the family begins to realize the danger they are in. The strange noises they had heard before were not the wind, but the approach of Krampus himself. One by one, the children start disappearing, their screams muffled by the snowstorm outside. Peter, now fully awake, runs to his parents' room, his heart pounding in his chest. But when he bursts through the door, he finds it empty. "Mom? Dad?" His voice cracks as he searches through the room. There's no answer. His eyes dart toward the window. The glass is cracked, shards of it scattered on the floor. The wind howls through the broken window, but there is no sign of his parents. Peter's mind races. He knows they're gone. He knows Krampus has taken them. And now, he is next. Part 4. The Chase. The family tries to escape the cabin, but the storm outside is too fierce and Krampus is already waiting for them. The night becomes a frantic race for survival as the creature hunts them down one by one. The woods outside are filled with shadows, and the footsteps of the beast echo as it closes in. Each of the family members must confront their own past mistakes as Krampus punishes them for their wrongdoings, forcing them to relive their worst memories before claiming them. As Peter fights to survive, he uncovers the horrifying truth. Krampus is not just a creature, but a force of nature, an ancient being who punishes the guilty. The only way to survive the night is to somehow escape his grasp. But in a world where every path leads back to him, is survival even possible? Peter stood in the center of the cabin, trembling with fear as the storm outside raged louder than ever. His thoughts raced, his heart pounded in his chest. He could no longer hear his family. The only sounds left were the wind, the storm, and the heavy dragging footsteps that echoed outside. He had to find a way out. But there was nowhere to go. The door to the cabin burst open with a force that sent the air rushing through the room. The flickering firelight cast monstrous shadows on the walls as Krampus entered the house. His dark, hulking form filled the doorway, and the low growl that rumbled from his throat chilled Peter to the bone. His horns scraped against the wooden frame of the door, and his eyes gleamed with a predatory hunger. There was something ancient in his gaze, something old and cruel that seemed to pierce into Peter's very soul. With each step the creature took, the air grew colder, the ground beneath Peter's feet beginning to freeze. "Peter!" a voice whispered, breaking through the storm's noise. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable, his mother's voice. He spun around, searching frantically. His heart leapt in his chest. Was she still here? Could she be alive? But when he turned, he saw nothing. Only the deep shadows of the cabin twisting in the firelight. The sound of chains rattling drew his attention back to the doorway. Krampus had moved closer, his massive form now looming just inside the room. The sack on his back, large and bulging, swung heavily as he moved forward. Peter backed away, his feet scraping the floor in a desperate attempt to distance himself from the nightmare before him. And then Krampus spoke. "Come to me, boy," the creature rumbled, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. Your sins have earned their reward." Peter's heart skipped a beat. "What do you want from me?" Krampus did not answer. Instead, he lunged forward, his massive hand reaching out, fingers clawing the air as if to seize Peter's soul. But Peter was faster. He ducked under the creature's hand and bolted for the back door, throwing it open and stumbling out into the snow. The cold air cut through Peter like 1,000 needles, the snow biting at his skin. His breath came in ragged gasps as he ran, not daring to look back. The trees loomed over him like dark sentinels, casting deep shadows in the moonlight. But it wasn't the trees that terrified him. It was the heavy footfalls that followed. Peter dared not look over his shoulder, but he could hear the creature's pursuit, growing closer with every passing second. The sound of Krampus's hooves hitting the snow was deafening, like the echo of death itself. Peter's only thought was survival, but he had no idea where to go. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction. There were no roads, no signs of civilization, just endless trees, snow, and the crushing weight of fear pressing down on him. And then, in the distance, he saw something. A flicker of movement. A shadow darting between the trees. He froze. Could it be another person? His heart skipped a beat. If someone else was out here, maybe they could help him. But the moment he moved closer, the shadow disappeared. Peter felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He wasn't alone. Something else was out here in the woods, and it wasn't Krampus. The sound of chains rattling echoed through the trees, and Peter spun around. Krampus was closing in fast. As Peter raced deeper into the woods, he heard another sound. A faint, distant voice calling his name. It was a woman's voice, strained and desperate. "Peter, help me." He stopped in his tracks, his heart racing. It was his mother's voice again. "Mom?" he whispered under his breath. The voice sounded so real, so close, but the snow-covered trees blocked his view, and the voice seemed to come from every direction. Was it Krampus? Was it his mother, trapped in the creature's grasp? The rustling grew louder. Footsteps, faster now, and the unmistakable sound of Krampus's chains scraping against the snow. Peter hesitated, his mind torn. Should he follow the voice or continue running? His instincts screamed at him to run, but there was a small voice in the back of his head that urged him to follow. It was his mother. She needed him. Before he could make up his mind, a shadow loomed over him, blocking the pale moonlight. He looked up, his blood turning to ice. Krampus stood there, towering over him. The creature's twisted face grinned wickedly, showing rows of sharp teeth. His red eyes gleamed with malevolent delight. "You should have stayed inside, boy," Krampus said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Now you'll join the others." Peter's heart pounded in his chest as he backed away. The creature raised one long clawed hand, ready to strike. But Peter wasn't finished yet. He turned and ran, faster than he ever had in his life. His legs burned, his body screamed in protest, but the fear driving him forward was stronger than any physical pain. He dashed between trees, ducking under branches, praying he could outrun the beast. Hours passed, but Peter could not escape. The snowstorm had grown fiercer, the winds now howling like a pack of wolves. The forest around him was nothing but an endless blur of white and shadows. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his limbs were numb from the cold. His thoughts were muddled, and his vision blurred. He stumbled, falling to his knees in the snow. The world around him was closing in. And then, just as he was about to give in, he saw it. A cabin. It stood there, nearly hidden by the thick trees, almost as if it had appeared out of nowhere. Its windows were dark, but the faintest light flickered behind the curtains. Could it be a way out? With what little strength he had left, Peter pushed himself to his feet and ran toward the cabin. His heart hammered in his chest, and his mind raced. Who could be inside? Could it be someone who could help? As he approached the cabin, he heard voices, faint whispers coming from within. He reached for the door and turned the handle. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The walls were lined with faded photographs, old, cracked frames depicting faces long forgotten. And at the center of the room was a large fireplace, where a low fire flickered. Peter stepped cautiously into the room, his eyes darting around. But as he took a step further, something caught his attention. A large, leather-bound book was lying on the table. It was open, its pages yellowed with age. Instinctively, Peter reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers brushed the page, a cold, unearthly presence filled the room. The door slammed shut behind him, and a voice echoed from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here, Peter." To be continued.